Alright, I'm gonna make lunch. You guys wanna watch me make sandwiches, I think I'm gonna make? And listen to Richard Wolf.
Free pass to any institution, you create
Listening to Richard Wolf and Chris Hedges.
behind the facade, and that's what I think.
2 for 1.
Income inequality in the United States has not been this pronounced in the century. The top 10% has 50% of the country's income, and the top 1% has 20% of the income. While a quarter of all American workers struggle on wages of less than $10 an hour, putting them below the poverty line, the salaries of the CEOs of top corporations are often in the billions of dollars. This income inequality is global. The richest 1% of the world's population controls 40% of the world's wealth. What does inequality this pronounced mean? And what are its consequences? How did it happen? And how much worse will it get with the new tax code that raises healthcare premiums, slashes social and public welfare programs such as Medicaid, Pell Grants, and food stamps, and ensures that tax hikes over the long term will climb for the working class? I discuss inequality with economist Rick Wolf. So we're at this late stage of capitalism, which the Trump administration is accelerating. It's part of a pattern. Tell us where we are.
Well, we're at a point that your numbers verify, in which the capitalist system, which has been the growing dominant system for the last 300 years, wanted to present itself in contradiction to feudalism and slavery as the system that creates a massive middle class that lifts everybody up. And what we have, now that it has become the global system, is the exact opposite. It has reproduced the kinds of grotesque inequalities that we associate with everything from the Versailles Palace of the late Louis back to the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. It is a stunning expose of an economic system that couldn't deliver what it promised, and now wants to distract everybody from this harsh reality that you pointed to. This is the major measure of a capitalist system by its own claims, and it can't deliver. That's why we're besieged with economic and political theater, anti-immigration, and tariffs, all that kind of stuff, blaming foreigners, anything to get us away from confronting an economic system that doesn't work for the majority of the people.
Well, not only does it not work, but the assault is being exacerbated, as we saw with the new tax code.
Well, the new tax code really is a kind of explosive excess. It's when you've crossed the line and finally it is so grotesque that even those who didn't want to see are forced to see. We see in that tax cut, if I can take a moment, we've had 30, 40 years in which corporations have paid less taxes than they ever did, have made more money than they ever did before, have been able to keep wages stagnant while the productivity of labor rose. This is the last moment historically that they needed another big gift, let alone at the expense of the very people whose wages have been stagnant. To give them a tax bust of this sort, basically reducing from 35% to 20% is 30%. But this kind of crazy excess does remind you of the late Louis in France before the French Revolution, when the level of excess reached the explosive social dimensions, and I think that's where we're going.
What about that moment in American history, which, that, let's call it the golden age of labor, right after World War II, when capitalism took credit for, and we did have for a period of a couple decades, a well-compensated working class, middle class. Workers could be part of the middle class.
Well, the irony, which people don't want to remember, is yes, that's true, but the irony is, why did it happen? And it happened because the last time capitalism crashed, in 1929, and that was the only one worse than what we are living through now since 2008, at that moment in history, we had a different American response. the mass of working people joined unions. These are people whose parents hadn't been in a union, they had never been in a union. They saw the union as a way to get through this depression with less damage than you otherwise would have had to undergo. And they joined socialist and communist parties, and those parties worked together with the labor union, the CIO, and you had a mass, and I don't use this word lightly, a mass uprising of victims of capitalism, shaking their finger at the system and basically giving Mr. Roosevelt and the political elite an ultimatum.
Well, he heard it. In his private correspondence, he talks about revolution.
Absolutely, because they told him, either you help us through this depression, or there will be a revolution. The CIO tended to want the help, the socialists and communists tilted the other way, and it was a good cop, bad cop kind of routine that was done, and he got the message. And that's why he created Social Security, unemployment compensation, the first minimum wage, and public employment.
12 million people put to work on the government.
And when you do all that, you create, for the first time, a real pushback against capitalism's basic tendency towards inequality. And so we had a few decades of the results of that.
Well, the irony is that Roosevelt said that one of his greatest achievements is that he saved capitalism.
Absolutely.
He understood that he ameliorated or adjusted a collapsing system, and he did save it. And yet, ever since, let's say, 1948 with Taft-Hartley, this draconian bill that makes it hard to organize forward, the capitalist class essentially sowed the seeds of their own destruction, didn't they?
That's the irony. He saved them from themselves, but they were so enraged by the fact that the way he paid for Social Security unemployment was by taxing corporations and the rich.
Which were up to 90%, right?
Amazing. 90% for the top bracket for the income tax, much higher rates on corporations. This notion that a politician would tax corporations and the rich to provide for the mass of people, which, by the way, nowadays is said to be a political impossibility. I like to remind people, the one politician who was forced to do it was reelected 3 times. It's not a route to
He was one of the most popular political figures in the country.
Clearly, in the history of the United States, no president had ever achieved that before. You would have thought Mr. Obama might have thought about that model in terms of his future, but that's another story. In any case, after the war, the reaction of the business community, enraged that they had to pay these taxes, were to destroy that coalition, communists, socialists, and unions. First go after the communists, convert them from militants into agents of a foreign power, then go around the country telling everybody that socialism is just like communism, it's just spelled differently, and when you got rid of them, you go after the labor movement, which has been, as we know, on a 50-year decline. So, yes, the capitalists got rid, but the irony is, you put it, they got rid of the coalition that forced it, but got rid of the very mechanism that Roosevelt told them saved you. And so we now have a crisis since 2008 without the movement possibilities because it is so systematically crushed. And so you have a capitalism spinning out of control, and Mr. Trump is like the cartoon alternative to Mr. Roosevelt. He doesn't get anything. He's on a rush to make it even more grandiose and effective, and I really do wonder how long this will last.
Well, that's the question, because lifting the very tepid reforms off the speculators on Wall Street, the global banks, what's going to happen? I mean, I think first, one of the things I'd like you to address just before that is how the figures that they use to justify what they call a recovery are in fact fictional.
Yeah, there's a number of ways in which this is done. You know, let me take a step back. In economics, if you're not an ideologist, you understand that at any moment there are an immense array of economic statistics. Some of them make it look like the future might be a little bit better. Others make it look like the future looking grim. A reasonable approach tries to weigh these. But if you don't do analysis, you do advertising or ideological blah, then you only look at the one and you pretend the other ones don't exist. So bear with me if I point out some of the data that don't show it. That is, don't show a recovery. Number one, the unemployment number that they love to talk about. The way unemployment numbers are gathered in America, so few people understand, is you ask a lot of people two questions. Are you working? If they say yes, they're employed. If they say no, you ask them a second question. Are you looking for work or are you not? If you say I am looking for work, you're counted as unemployed. If you say I'm not looking, you are counted as out of the labor force. You are not counted as unemployed. And you don't need to be a statistical genius to understand that if over the last 10 years, a significant number of people gave up looking because it's too disgusting, because the jobs they were offered were so inferior to what they had before, that the jobs they offered were so insecure as to make their family life impossible, so they either went back to school or went into the illegal economy or began to live off their friends, relatives, and neighbors, then you think unemployment rate went down as if this were an improvement. But the actuality is it's a deterioration, and we know that because what it does is it leaves a smaller number of people in the labor force to support the entire population, and that's fundamentally a bad thing.
But it also does things, if you work 28 hours a week at Walmart, which is the average hourly work week at Walmart, you're still below the poverty line. And the Walton family, which is making $11,000 an hour, will quite generously give you forms for food stamps because you qualify. But I mean, there are all sorts of, I read somewhere that even if you're working 1 hour a week, you're counted as employed.
Yes, you are. You're put in the temporary category or part-time category. There's endless games that are being played. The bottom line is, as even the most right-wing of my colleagues admits, that the quality of the job, its security, its benefits, its impact on your physical and mental health, all of that has been cascading down, even though wages have remained stagnant, so that by any of those measures, we're not in a recovery. We're in an ongoing decline, which, by the way, is why Mr. Trump got elected. It's happening to capitalism in Western Europe, Japan, and the United States. It's why an angry working class is looking for ways to express and change its circumstance. It's kind of sad for me that the form in this country, for many, took the step of electing Trump. It's sad for me that in Britain the same working class decided to get rid of its relationship to Europe, imagining that, yes, this was giving your finger to the elite, but it wasn't solving your problem. That's the issue. To get the people who are upset to begin to understand that the target is what the folks who were upset in the 1930s understood was the target, the people at the top, the unfair tax structure, the whole way the economy was organized. That's our problem.
Well, the problem is that, in essence, we've lost control over our economy. And you saw it with, Stuart Hall writes about this, with Thatcher and Reagan began this shift with the deconstruction of kind of the welfare state under
Ronnie Reagan
deal. The political rhetoric said, well, this is an assault on your national identity.
Trickle down economics.
Which really began a few decades ago and epitomizes essentially Trump's response to the economic and political crisis.
Well, you know, when you have a welfare system, put aside the details, you are in a way suggesting that the community as a whole, that the society as a whole, has a responsibility to itself, and that if the private sector can't or won't manage that, well, then the public sector steps in. It's really what Roosevelt said when he went on the radio and he said, if there's millions of Americans who ask for nothing other than a job, and the private sector can't provide it, then it's up to me who else is going to do it. We have this implicit in our welfare system. If you cut back welfare, you're basically throwing people back into an and total dependence on the private sector, which is showing you by the $15 an hour or less group, the Walmarts, the retail joints, what these are being, what's happening to people that are thrown on a private capitalist sector that cannot or will not function in anything like a socially acceptable way.
Great. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Rick Wolff on economic inequality. Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our conversation
Look at Jasper, look at that.
So before the break, we raised the issue of
Well,
unfair
that's it.
capitalism, which Karl Marx said
How
is
long
a
it take me?
revolutionary force.
15 minutes to make sandwiches, and then however long it takes to
imposed by Dodd-Frank
to cook.
so much. And everything's being.
you guys tell me when that thing turns green, okay?
What will that do to the economy?
Well, it produces the very thing that folks used to want
Tell
to
me when that
celebrate
turns green.
capitalism for. Instead of creating a middle class, it polarizes everything. It
I think,
allows top executives to
keep
go
listening.
crazy with their pay packages. Not only beyond what's reasonable in any sense, but even beyond what their fellow capitalists in other parts of the world
Well, and
allow
just to
themselves.
interject, I mean, with this tax cut,
They're only worse.
what they did with that money was buy back their stock,
That's right.
and which is suicidal for the economy. Explain why they did that and why I agree.
What's it
Suicidal.
blinking for?
Absolutely. This is a game in which there is a collapse of the mass ability of people to buy things. So a company that saves all this money through a tax cut from Mr. Trump is not, of course, going to spend its money hiring people, buying machines, and producing more. They're having trouble selling what they already produce, and they're impoverishing the very people they would have to sell to. So what do they do with the money instead? Well, they take it and play for themselves. They run the society, they serve themselves. They do it by giving themselves higher pay packages, but they do it by buying back their own stock, which they're legally allowed to
Raises the
do.
price of the stock,
Builds the price of the stock
and their
up.
compensation goes up.
And their compensation, which is connected to how well the price of the stock does, is thereby helped by their own usage.
And
No
they're-
jobs are created, no growth
They're
is
often
created.
trashing their own company in the process.
Yes.
That's Lehman Brothers. I mean.
Yeah, and because they're out of control, building a price of the stock that is going up, even though the viability of the enterprise, because of the collapsing market, is shrinking. And if you wanted a case for there to be any negative outcome, even for their own thinking, it means that the only growth in terms of real production is happening elsewhere in the world because we're killing the very mechanism that might have produced it here. So it's a capitalism that is hollowing itself out, but refuses to do so, to face it, because it is making money for a while. But that's the same logic as King Louis before the French Revolution, in a sense, making fantastic Versailles without understanding he was digging his own grave in those lovely gardens there.
Before we go on to the consequences, let's talk about the imposition of tariffs.
Fine. Tariffs is a way, for me, in this country at this time, of political theater. It is Mr. Trump's government wanting to get attention away from an economic system that isn't working for people, for his role as a booster for that very system. So instead, he wants to focus us on foreigners. It's a classic ploy of crooked politicians stuck with a problem of their own making, blaming somebody else. So we take the poor 10 or 11 million immigrants in this country with questionable legal status, and we demonize them, we scapegoat them. They couldn't possibly account for the difficulties of this country, and throwing them out will not fundamentally change the dynamic of this economy. It's childishly easy to show that, but it's good theater. I am smiting the foreigner. In that frame, see the tariff. It's another way to smite the foreigner. The tariff is a punishment of others. These days, the bugaboo that we want to get angry at is China. Good, that's another foreigner, and they are the bad ones, and they are doing this. I like to remind people of two things about these tariffs, or three. One, historically they don't work very well. It's very easy to evade. For example, we put a tariff on, say, steel from China. Okay, we won't, they will have to pay. So what do the Chinese do? They come to deal with the Canadians, or the Mexicans, or the Koreans, or the Europeans, sell it to them, who resell it here. It's on the same ship coming here, it just has a different flag at the back. This is childish, it's well known, number one. Number two, it's political theater because it doesn't change very much. For example, a good half of the goods that come from China come from subsidiaries of American corporations that went there over the last 30 years precisely to produce there for the American market. You are smiting them by closing off their market. They're going to be angry, they're going to be losing their investments, they're going to be taking corrective action, all of which is negative for the American economy. It's bizarre. And finally, the Chinese, their politicians being not that different from ours, will have to posture in return and retaliate in all kinds of ways they're already showing against
Time to go eat.
products.
Bon appetit.